The ink on my grandfather's will wasn't even dry before my parents, the people who abandoned me, filed the lawsuit. My name is Melissa Martin. They stood in a cold law office and called me a liar, a manipulator, a snake who stole their inheritance. They didn't just want his money. They wanted to liquidate his entire company, burn his legacy to the ground, and put 200 people out of work. They thought I was a grieving girl they could roll over. They had no idea what I was about to find in his office. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of wet dirt hitting the casket lid was a sickening final thud. I stood under a black umbrella watching the rain plaster clumps of fake green cemetery turf to the gravedigger's boots. The minister droned on about ashes to ashes, but the words were just noise lost in the smell of damp wool and the cloying sweetness of cheap lilies. My grandfather was gone. I focused on the details, the gray Ohio sky, the way the raindrops collected on the polished mahogany, because looking at the hole in the ground felt like staring into an abyss. I could feel them rather than see them a few feet away. My parents, Karen and Robert Martin, strangers who shared my DNA. My mother wore a pair of oversized designer sunglasses, an absurd choice for a day so dim you could barely see your own feet. Her grief was a performance, and a bad one at that. My father, Robert, just looked restless, his eyes scanning the sparse crowd, checking his watch as if he had a more important appointment to get to. He hadn't looked at the grave once. This wasn't my real life. This was their hollow charade. My first memory isn't of my mother's sharp chemical perfume. It's of hot metal sawdust and the worn leather of my grandfather's work gloves. Art Vance's workshop was my sanctuary. I was 4, maybe 5, and he was holding my tiny hand, showing me how to use a micrometer. His voice was a low rumble vibrating through my small body. "Measure twice, cut once, Lissa," he'd said, his eyes kind but serious. "That's the rule for steel, and it's the rule for life." He never spoke to me like I was a child. He spoke to me like I was a person. He was the only one who did. My parents had left me with him and my grandmother Clara when I was 3. Their official story, the one they told at cocktail parties, was that they were finding themselves in California. The reality was, they were chasing phantom get-rich-quick schemes, one after the other, each one a spectacular failure funded by what I later learned were investments from Arthur. Their visits were rare, disruptive, and always felt like photo ops. They'd breeze in with a flurry of bright, inappropriate gifts, smelling like airports and hairspray, take a few smiling pictures with me, their darling little girl, and then disappear again. They'd leave a Melissa-shaped prop behind a girl who felt more like a rumor than a daughter. When Grandma Clara died, I was 19, and the thin, brittle thread connecting me to them snapped for good. The bond between me and Arthur crystallized. It was no longer just weekend visits and summer breaks. I stayed. After I got my engineering degree, I didn't even look for a job elsewhere. I came home to Vance Manufacturing, the company Arthur had built from nothing. I learned the business from the ground up. The machines, the people, the smell of the coolant, the rhythm of the line. I wasn't just his granddaughter. I was his apprentice. He told me once, his voice thick with a pride that made my throat ache, that I was his best partner. Now, back at the graveside, the minister finally shut his book. The small crowd of employees and old friends began to disperse, offering me brief, awkward condolences. I watched my parents. They hadn't shed a real tear. As the last of the mourners drifted away, my mother stepped toward me, her heels sinking into the mud. She pulled off her sunglasses, her eyes hard and impatient. "Well, that's done," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "The lawyer wants to see us all at his office. Let's get this over with." I just stared at her, the rain dripping from my umbrella, the cold seeping into my bones. "Get what over with?" My father, finally looking at me, just shrugged his gaze, flicking nervously toward the gates. "The will, Melissa," he said as if I were an idiot. "Try to keep up." I felt a dread so cold it burned, a sudden, terrifying premonition that the funeral wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The law office was suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of old paper floor wax and the stale perfume my mother must have sprayed in the car. I sat on a hard-backed leather chair that squeaked every time I breathed. Ben Carter, the lawyer, sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking pale and young. Across from me, my parents were a portrait of agitated impatience. Robert, my father, was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving in a relentless, angry blur. My mother, Karen, wasn't even pretending to be sad anymore. She was tapping her gold pen against the desk, a sharp, rapid click, click, click that drilled straight into my skull. "Ben, can we please speed this along?" She finally snapped, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "As you know, we have a flight to catch. This whole small-town ritual is excessive." Ben flinched, cleared his throat, and shuffled the thick stack of papers in front of him. "Of course, Karen. Robert, this is the last will and testament of Arthur Vance." He began to read. The legal language was a drone, a wash of hereof, whereas and bequeath that my mind struggled to hold on to. I was still seeing the rain on the casket, still smelling the lilies. Then I heard my name. All remaining personal effects, including the property at 4 and 12 Elm Street, all savings and associated investment portfolios, I leave to my beloved granddaughter Melissa Martin. My father's scrolling stopped. My mother's pen went still. I felt a sudden crushing weight, a responsibility that felt less like a gift and more like an anchor. But Ben wasn't finished. "And furthermore," he continued, his voice gaining a slight nervous tremor, "I leave my 85% controlling interest in Vance Manufacturing and the company itself in its entirety to Melissa Martin." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air before a tornado rips the sky open. Then came the sound. A sharp, choked gasp from my mother, like she'd been punched in the stomach. "What?" she whispered, the word cracking. "What did you say?" Before Ben could answer, my father lunged forward, slamming both palms flat on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. "He was senile," he roared, his face turning a blotchy, furious red. "There is no other explanation. That old bastard was senile, and she knows it." My mother's mask of bored, impatient grief didn't just slip, it vaporized. The face underneath was something I had never seen before, a twisted mask of pure reptilian rage. She rose slowly from her chair, her movement stiff, and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You." The word was pure venom. "You did this. You poisoned him against us. All those years, you little snake, whispering in his ear." She took a step toward me, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Pretending to be the good granddaughter, the one who cared. You were just waiting, weren't you? Waiting for him to get old and confused so you could sink your teeth in and take it all." The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth of our relationship, the hours in the workshop, the shared dinners, the quiet respect, that it felt like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't feeling triumph. I wasn't feeling rich. I was horrified. This wasn't the pain of loss. This was the cold, ugly face of greed. Before I could find my voice, another man stepped out from the corner of the room. He was older, wearing a sharp, dark suit I knew must have cost more than my car. I hadn't even registered his presence. He'd been sitting there the whole time, a shark on standby. He placed a hand on my mother's shoulder and looked at Ben. "We will be contesting this, obviously," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "This is a textbook case of undue influence and elder manipulation." He then turned his dismissive gaze on me, looking me up and down as if I were something he'd scraped off his shoe. "We'll see you in court, Miss Martin. We will strip this from you. And we will make absolutely certain this entire town knows exactly what kind of person you are." They stormed out, a whirlwind of rage and expensive cologne. The real war, however, began exactly 1 week later. I was on the factory floor trying to reassure the shift foreman that nothing was changing when a process server walked right up to me. He handed me a thick envelope. The lawsuit was real, but that wasn't the worst of it. Tucked inside the pages of slander was an emergency injunction. They were petitioning the court to have me removed as executor and to freeze all of the company's assets effective immediately. The motion claimed I was emotionally unstable and a grasping, immediate threat to the company's solvency. My blood ran cold. The paychecks. The paychecks for 200 employees were due next Friday. They weren't just trying to take my inheritance. They were trying to liquidate it. They were going to burn my grandfather's entire legacy to the ground just to get the cash from the ashes. The attack came 2 days later, not from a lawyer, but from the front page of the Maysville Gazette. I saw it from the sidewalk, a stack of papers sitting outside the corner market. The headline in thick black letters screamed, "Vance heir sued by parents." My stomach hollowed out. I fumbled $1 from my pocket and grabbed a copy. The article was brutal. It was a masterpiece of innuendo, painting me as a scheming relative, an opportunistic granddaughter who had manipulated a grieving elderly man. The worst part, the part that made me want to be sick right there on the pavement, were the quotes from my mother. She spoke of her devastating loss and how she and my father had been callously shut out in their father's final, confused years. "We're not doing this for the money," she lied, her words dripping with false sorrow. "We're doing this to honor our father's true wishes and protect his legacy from those who preyed on his vulnerability." From me. I walked in a daze, the paper crushed in my hand, and mechanically pushed open the door to the Main Street diner. It was the place Arthur and I went every Saturday for breakfast. The conversations didn't just quiet, they stopped. It was a sudden suffocating vacuum of sound, replaced by the clatter of a fork on a plate. I saw the Gazette spread open on half the tables. Every eye was on me. Maria, the waitress who had known me since I was a child, the one who always slipped me extra bacon, wouldn't meet my gaze. She just picked up a coffee pot and turned her back to me, her shoulders stiff. As I stood there frozen by the door, the whispers started. "That's her. Took it all they say. Right from his own daughter." I turned and fled. This was the true outrage. This was the real violation. They weren't just attacking me in a courtroom. They were poisoning my home. They were turning the community Arthur had built, the people he had employed and supported for 50 years, against me. I locked myself in the house. The silence, which had once been a comfort, now felt heavy and accusatory. I spread the legal filings across the dining room table, the clinical, cruel language describing me as a predator, a manipulator. Ava Morrison exerted undue influence. For one terrifying, sickening moment, I almost believed them. That's what they do. They convince you you're the villain for finally setting a boundary. Had I taken advantage of his loneliness after Clara died? Had I spent all those hours in the workshop just waiting? The vulnerability crept in cold and sharp, and I began to second-guess every memory, every shared laugh, every quiet moment of work. I was drowning. The knock on the door made me jump. I ignored it. It came again, harder. "Melissa, I know you're in there. Open the door." It was Ben Carter. He stood on the porch, his suit rumpled, holding a bag of takeout. He looked exhausted. He nodded at the copy of the Gazette on my table. "Don't read that trash," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My first car. A '98 Rust Bucket. Your grandfather co-signed the loan when I was 19 and had zero credit. He paid for my bar prep course, told me I had a disagreeable face perfect for cross-examination." He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. He wasn't senile, Lissa. He was the sharpest man I ever knew. This isn't about him being confused. This is about them being greedy. He dropped the takeout bag on the table. "Now we have a bigger problem than the newspaper." He pulled out the injunction filing. "This is the real threat. Your parents' lawyer is smart. They know contesting a will takes years. They don't have years, and they don't want the factory. It's too much work." I was confused. "Then what do they want?" Ben's face was grim. "The injunction. If the judge grants it and freezes the accounts, Vance Manufacturing flatlines, payroll stops, the suppliers walk, the contracts are voided. They're not trying to win the company, Lissa. They're trying to liquidate it. They're forcing a sale. They want to cash out, burn the whole thing to the ground, and walk away with the ashes. They'll get millions, and 200 people will be out of a job by Christmas. He paced the kitchen, the reality of it settling over me like a shroud. Their entire case, he said, stopping to face me, rests on undue influence. They say you isolated him, that you're the only reason he cut them off. We have to prove he did it intentionally. We have to prove he had a damn good reason. He ran a hand through his hair. We need a why, Lissa. Arthur was a man who measured twice. He had to know this was coming. He must have left you something. The house was no longer a home. It was a cold, quiet prison. Ben's warning about the injunction had left me adrift, paralyzed by the sudden terrifying reality of my situation. The whispers from town, the casual cruelty of my parents' lawsuit, it all circled me, and I was drowning in the vulnerability they'd created. I felt small, weak, just like the little girl they'd abandoned. I found myself standing at the door to Arthur's workshop, the one place that had always felt safe. The familiar smell of cutting oil, hot metal, and old leather hung in the air, a ghost of his presence. I ran my hand over the scarred wooden workbench. Measure twice, cut once, Lissa. His voice echoed in my memory. He wouldn't have just sat here waiting for the wolves to break down the door. He would have acted. He would have been prepared. And so would I. I was done being the victim. Ben said we needed a why. He said Arthur must have left something. But Ben was a lawyer. He was looking for a legal document, another will and addendum. I knew Arthur. He was an engineer. He kept receipts. My proactive choice was made. I wasn't waiting for a legal miracle. I was going on a hunt. I left the workshop and walked to his private office in the house, a room he always kept locked, the one place that was his alone. I still had his keychain. The lock clicked open and the door swung wide. The room smelled of him, old paper pipe tobacco, and the leather of his armchair. I started searching not for a letter but for records. I pulled open the deep drawers of his desk. I ran my fingers through the filing cabinets. Nothing. Just old blueprints, supplier contracts, company ledgers, all things Ben had already seen, all part of the official business. Frustration began to build. I sank into his big leather chair, my head in my hands, the silence of the room pressing in. Measure twice. Where would he hide something? Not in plain sight. Not in a drawer. I ran my hand along the smooth, cool underside of the massive oak desk. My fingers brushed against something, a small piece of tape. I leaned down, contorting myself to see. Taped deep in the shadows, almost against the back panel, was a single small, cold key. It wasn't a house key. It wasn't for a car. My eyes scanned the room. The thick, worn Persian rug. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, shot through me. I kicked the rug aside. The hardwood floor beneath was clean except for one spot. A small round brass plate flush with the boards, with a keyhole in the center. A floor safe. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could barely breathe. I jammed the key into the lock. It turned. The metal lid was heavy. I pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside there was no cash, no jewelry, just two items. The first was a single heavy black accounting ledger, the old-fashioned kind, bound in faux leather. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift it. I placed it on the desk and opened it. The first page was dated 1998. The handwriting was his sharp, precise engineering script. It was a meticulous, horrifying log. March 1998, $15,000. Robert bailout, import-export scheme. July 2004, $40,000. Karen credit card consolidation. Final payment she promised. Feb 2011, $80,000. Robert gambling debt, Vegas. Called, said they would break his legs. Page after page, decades of it. A steady, relentless hemorrhage of money. He'd been funding their failures, their addictions, their entire reckless, parasitic lives. I turned to the last page. He had tallied it up. A final underlined number circled twice. Over $1.8 million. The second item in the safe was a small black external hard drive the size of a credit card. It was labeled with a single word, proof. My blood ran cold. I plugged it into my laptop right there on his desk. The drive opened. It was worse than the ledger. The ledger was the what. This was the how. Folders, scanned emails, copies of bounced checks they'd written him, and a folder labeled simply voicemails. My cursor hovered trembling. I clicked the first file. My mother's voice filled the silent room. Not the smooth, controlled voice she used in public, but a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Dad, please, I just need $50K. It's the last time, I swear. Robert's new venture is a sure thing. Don't be cruel." I clicked another. My father. His voice was slurred, angry. "Aren't you owe me? You've been hoarding that money long enough. Are you really going to let your only daughter be homeless? What kind of man are you?" I felt sick. This was the soundtrack of their betrayal. I clicked on the emails folder. The last one. The date stamp made me gasp. It was the day after Grandma Clara's funeral. The day after. It was from Karen. "Dad, I know you're upset, but this might be a blessing in disguise. That house is way too big for you, and the upkeep must be a nightmare. Robert and I have found a developer who is very interested in the land. We could get 7 figures easy. You could move into a nice, secure condo, and we could manage the proceeds for you." They were vultures circling before the body was even cold. I sat on the floor, the ledger open in my lap, the sound of my mother's voice still echoing. The sorrow I'd been carrying. It was gone. The vulnerability, the self-doubt. It burned away. In its place was something else, a cold, hard, crystalline clarity. "He wasn't senile," I whispered to the empty room clutching the hard drive. He was done. I didn't call Ben. I just walked into his office, the black ledger tucked under my arm, the small hard drive clutched tightly in my hand. He was on the phone, his back to the door, sounding stressed, arguing with another lawyer about a filing deadline. He saw my reflection in the window, muttered, "I have to call you back," and hung up. "Lissa, what is it? I'm buried here." I didn't say a word. I walked to his desk, placed the heavy ledger in the center, and slid the hard drive next to it. He looked at the items, then at my face. He opened the ledger first. I watched his eyes scan the precise handwritten lines on the first page. He flipped to another, and another. His jaw went slack. "My God," he whispered, his finger tracing a single entry. 80 grand. For Vegas debt. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a lawyer's predatory gleam. He kept a record. He kept all of it. Then he saw the hard drive. "What's that, the sequel?" I just nodded. "The proof." He plugged it in. We sat in the humming silence of his office as he clicked through the scanned emails, the copies of bounced checks, and then the folder labeled voicemails. He played the one of my mother, her voice high and whining for $50K. He physically winced. Then he played my father's drunk and belligerent, demanding his due. Ben leaned back in his chair, running both hands over his face, and let out a low whistle. "This isn't a why, Lissa. This is a nuke. This is a tactical thermonuclear nuke." His energy changed instantly. The exhausted defensive lawyer I'd seen last week was gone, replaced by a shark who smelled blood in the water. He shot up from his chair and began to pace. "We can ruin them," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and energized. "This isn't just a defense anymore, it's an offense. We countersue. Defamation, absolutely. Harassment. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. We can take them for every penny they thought they were going to get. We can drag this out for years, Lissa. We can bleed them dry just like they did to him." I held up my hand. "No." He stopped pacing, looking at me like I was crazy. "No, Lissa, this is the case of a lifetime." I shook my head, the cold, hard clarity I'd found in Arthur's office settling deep in my bones. "I don't want their money, Ben. I don't want to become them. I don't want to drag this out for years, because in the time it takes us to bleed them dry, Vance Manufacturing will be dead." That injunction hearing is in 2 weeks. They'll freeze the assets and it'll all be over before we even get to discovery. This was my moment of empowerment, the pivot from vulnerability to agency. I was no longer the scared, grieving girl. I was the executor. I want it over, I said, my voice low and steady. I want a mandatory settlement conference. I want them in a room. I want their shark from Columbus in that room. And I want you to read that ledger to them line by line. Ben was about to argue, his legal mind rebelling against a quick, clean kill, when his secretary buzzed his intercom. Mr. Carter, there's a Mr. Rossi, here to see Miss Martin. He says it's urgent. My heart jumped. Sal Rossi was the plant foreman. He'd worked shoulder to shoulder with Arthur for 40 years. Send him in, I said. Sal walked in, his worn hat clutched in his hands, his face etched with a worry that mirrored my own. He looked older than he had at the funeral. Melissa, he corrected himself, his voice rough. The guys, the crew, were scared. This talk of freezing accounts, of shutting us down. We got families, Melissa. We need to know. Are you fighting for this place? He looked at me with such desperate, decent hope, and it solidified everything. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance, I was fighting for them. I'm fighting Sal, I said, my voice finding a strength I didn't know I had. And I'm going to win. Tell the crew to hang on. I've got this. He searched my face for a long second, then gave a single determined nod. You tell us what you need, boss. We're with you, Art. He wouldn't let us down. Neither will you. He left, and the resolve in the room was absolute. I turned back to Ben. His expression had softened. He finally understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was a rescue. A settlement conference, he said, nodding slowly. Aggressive. I like it. He sat down at his computer, his fingers flying. I'll file the emergency motion right now. We'll cite new dispositive evidence that will resolve all matters of the injunction and the contest. A grim smile touched his lips. Their lawyer, Harris. He's arrogant. He'll see this as us being desperate. He'll think you're scared of the injunction and ready to fold. Good, I said. Let him. Ben was right. The response from Harris came in less than an hour. They eagerly agreed to the conference. They thought I was coming to surrender. The day of the conference was cold and bright. The rented mediation room was sterile, soulless, and smelled like burnt coffee. They were already there when we walked in. My parents and their shark. They looked smug, radiating a confidence that made my stomach turn. My mother, Karen, was dressed in a soft cream-colored suit, the very picture of wounded maternal innocence. She gave me a look of pitying contempt as I sat down opposite her. Melissa, dear, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, loud enough for the mediator to hear clearly. I'm so glad you're ready to be reasonable. This has all been so painful for us. She reached over and patted my father's hand. Just give us the company. You can keep the house. We're being generous. I didn't react. I just placed my bag on the floor, the hard drive heavy inside it. I looked at Ben, who had the black ledger in his own briefcase. I gave him a single imperceptible nod. Let's begin. The conference room on the 12th floor of a sterile downtown office building was utterly devoid of personality. Beige walls, beige carpet, and a long polished table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above. It was a room designed for capitulation, for breaking spirits. At the head of the table sat the mediator, a retired judge with a weary, deeply lined face, who looked like he'd seen every sin humanity had to offer, and was impressed by none of them. And then there were my parents flanking their shark from Columbus. Harris. He was the picture of corporate aggression, all sharp pinstripes, a power tie, and a smile that didn't touch his cold eyes. He was oozing a confidence that was almost theatrical. He began before the mediator could even finish his opening remarks, his voice smooth and rehearsed, as if addressing a jury. Your Honor, he began. This case is at its heart a profound American tragedy. He gestured magnanimously toward my parents. We are here representing the devastated natural-born children of Arthur Vance. Children who loved their father, who respected him, but who were forced to watch helpless as he succumbed to grief and confusion in his final vulnerable years. He paused, letting the words hang in the dead air, then turned his gaze on me. It was like being pinned by an insect collector, forced to watch as he was preyed upon by an opportunistic granddaughter who systematically isolated him and exploited his vulnerability for her own staggering financial gain. I gripped my hands in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. Not in anger, not anymore. I was using the faint pain to ground myself to keep the cold clarity I'd found in Arthur's office. I watched them as if from a great distance. This was Karen's cue. My mother, dressed in funereal gray, produced a delicate folded tissue from her sleeve and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. We just wanted our father," she began, her voice trembling with a practiced, rehearsed sorrow that made my stomach clench. "We tried so hard to reach him, especially after Clara, after our mother passed." She shot a look at me, a perfect performance of heartbroken accusation. "But Melissa, she built a wall. She wouldn't let us see him. She wouldn't put him on the phone. She fed him lies, told him we just wanted his money." Her voice cracked on the word money, a masterful touch. It's all she ever talked about. It's all she cared about. And he was old, and he was sad, and he believed her. It was so vile, so completely inverted from the truth, that for a second the sheer audacity of it left me breathless. Robert, playing his part as the simple, heartbroken son, just shook his head slowly, staring at his hands on the table. "I'm not a numbers guy, Your Honor," he mumbled, his voice thick with counterfeit emotion. "I just know my father loved me. He loved us. This piece of paper they call a will. It's not him. It's not the man who raised me. She twisted him. She poisoned him against his own family." I watched Ben. He was listening intently, his face a perfect mask of polite professional concern. He nodded along as Harris spoke, feigning sympathy, as my mother cried. He let them talk for nearly 20 minutes, let them spin their entire sordid fantasy, let them bury themselves deeper and deeper under the weight of their own lies. My parents, high on their own performance, and Harris's absolute arrogance, didn't see the trap. They just saw a small-town lawyer out of his depth and ready to fold. Finally, Ben leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. He looked at Harris, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "I just want to clarify the position for the mediator, Mr. Harris, so I'm perfectly clear." Harris gave a condescending, magnanimous nod. "Your position," Ben continued, "is that your clients had a loving, close, and consistent relationship with Arthur Vance, that they were his devoted children who tried repeatedly to be in his life, and that the only conceivable reason he would disinherit them is because my client Miss Martin exerted undue influence and poisoned his mind against them. Is that an accurate summary?" Harris smiled. It was the smile of a predator who thinks the prey has just tripped and broken its leg. "That is precisely our position, Mr. Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair, radiating smug victory. "He was a loving father, manipulated in his grief. They are the natural primary objects of his bounty. What other reason could there be?" The air in the room crackled. This was it. The moment. Ben's polite, apologetic demeanor vanished, replaced by the cold precision of a surgeon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply reached into his briefcase, pulled out the heavy black ledger, and slid it across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Harris. The thud was the only sound in the room, loud as a gavel strike. Harris stared at it, confused. What is this?" My mother's fake tears stopped instantly, her eyes narrowing at the book. "That's private." She snapped, a flicker of genuine raw panic in her voice. Ben looked her dead in the eye. Then let's talk about the $1.8 million you bled from him. The air in the room fractured. The change was instant, palpable. The smug, rehearsed confidence evaporated, replaced by a raw, animal panic. This, Ben said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a death sentence, is a record. A meticulously kept handwritten record of every loan, bailout, and investment Arthur Vance paid to you and Mr. Martin dating back to 1998. He flipped open the ledger, his eyes scanning the page before he looked up first at my mother, then my father. Let's start with a big one. February 2011. He looked directly at my father. $80,000 wired to a casino in Las Vegas. Arthur's note here says, Robert called crying, said they would break his legs. How many more times? My father, who had been playing the part of the simple, heartbroken son, made a small choking sound. He didn't just pale. He seemed to shrink in his chair, a sudden visible collapse, as if his bones had gone soft. My mother shot him a look of pure venom, not sympathy. Ben wasn't finished. July 2004, $40,000. Karen credit card consolidation. The note, final payment she promised. He turned the page. March 1998, 15,000. Robert import-export scheme. Note, another failure. He'll never learn. You claim you were shut out. Ben continued, his voice relentless, surgical. He pulled my laptop from his bag, opened it, and angled it toward the mediator. You claim you were desperate to reach him, that I was the one who built a wall. He clicked a file. My mother's voice, high-pitched, whining, and utterly devoid of dignity, filled the sterile room. Dad, please. I just need $50K. It's the last time, I swear. Robert's new venture is a sure thing. Don't be cruel. You have no idea what we're dealing with out here. The color drained from my mother's face. Ben clicked the next file without comment. My father's voice, slurred, drunk, and thick with a terrifying, entitled rage, boomed from the small speakers. Art, you owe me. You've been hoarding that money long enough. Are you really going to let your only daughter be homeless? What kind of man are you? Harris. The pinstriped shark looked like he'd been physically punched. His face was ashen. He was staring at his clients as if seeing them for the first time, the dawning horror of a lawyer who just realized his clients hadn't just lied to him, they had built their entire case on a fantasy. But this, Ben said, his voice dropping, is my favorite. This is the loving daughter who was so devastated by her father's grief. He clicked open a file. It was a scanned email. To Arthur Vance, from Karen Martin. Subject, the house. The mediator leaned forward, reading the screen as Ben read the words aloud. Dad, I know you're upset, but this might be a blessing in disguise. That house is way too big for you, and the upkeep must be a nightmare. Robert and I have found a developer who is very interested in the land. We could get 7 figures easy. You could move into a nice secure condo, and we could manage the proceeds for you. Ben looked up, his gaze like ice. This email, Your Honor, is dated March 2nd, 2018, the day after Clara Vance's funeral. The silence that fell was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and all the lies from the room. The mediator, who had looked so weary, now stared at my parents with a look of pure, undisguised contempt. Harris, pale and furious, made a sharp, angry movement, snapping his briefcase shut. The sound was as final as a guillotine. We need to confer with our clients, privately. I spoke for the first time. My voice was low, steady, and cold, cutting right through his attempt to regain control. No, we're done conferring. All eyes snapped to me. Harris looked startled, as if he'd forgotten I could speak. You filed an injunction that threatened the jobs of 200 people, I said, looking directly at my parents. You slandered me in the newspaper in my own town. You sat here in this room and you lied about a man who did nothing but give you everything. I leaned forward, the cold clarity now a blade. You didn't want a father. You wanted an ATM. And when he finally turned the machine off, you tried to break it open. I turned my gaze to Harris. Here is the settlement. There is no negotiation. You will drop the lawsuit. You will drop the injunction immediately. You will sign a full and final release of all claims to the estate. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you will never contact me or any employee of Vance Manufacturing ever again. You will do that right now. Harris sputtered. You can't demand. Or, I interrupted, this hard drive and a certified copy of that ledger go to the Maysville Gazette. Your choice. My mother, her face a twisted, ugly mask of hatred, finally looked at me. You would ruin us, she hissed. I looked at her, at the woman who had abandoned me, lied about me, and tried to destroy everything I loved. You don't seem to understand, I said. You were already ruined. He just stopped paying for your secrets. Harris didn't even try to argue. His face was a mask of cold reptilian fury, not at us, but at his clients for their catastrophic, expensive lies. He shoved the settlement papers printed and ready from Ben's briefcase across the table. Sign it, he hissed. My mother's hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, her signature a jagged, spidery line. My father just stared at the page, a puppet with his strings cut, and signed where Harris pointed. In less than 20 minutes, a war that had been my entire life was over. The mediator, with a final withering look of contempt for my parents, gathered his notes and left the room without another word. Ben and I stood up. We didn't look at them again. We just walked out, leaving them behind in that sterile beige room to choke on the ashes of their own greed. The elevator ride down was silent, but it was a good silence, the heavy, solid silence of an ending. When we pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the street, the cold Ohio air hit my face, and it felt like the first clean breath I had taken in my entire life. I stopped on the sidewalk and just breathed. The silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Ben was already on his phone, a grim smile on his face. It's done, he said to his office. File the dismissal and the signed release with the court effective immediately, and call the bank. The injunction is dead. By 5 o'clock that evening, the emergency hold on the company accounts was lifted. Payroll was processed right on time. The next morning, the Maysville Gazette ran a new headline. It was simple, factual, and to me, it was the most beautiful sentence ever written. Lawsuit dropped. Melissa Martin assumes full control of Vance MFG. When I walked onto the plant floor the next morning, the familiar high-pitched whine of the lathes and the rhythmic thump of the presses continued for a moment. Then one by one the machines went silent. The sudden quiet was deafening, a physical weight. 200 faces turned to look at me. I saw Sal the foreman standing by the main conveyor, his worn cap clutched in his hands. He looked at me, his weathered face breaking into a slow, wide smile, and he began to clap. It wasn't a fast, polite clap. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic applause. Then the man next to him joined in. Then the whole line. Within seconds, the entire factory floor was filled with a thunderous, echoing applause that shook the steel rafters. It wasn't just for me. It was for Arthur. It was for us. This was the community he'd built. This was the true inheritance. My parents disappeared. They didn't just leave town. They vanished. No calls, no more letters, no more attempts to claw their way back in. The silence they had always used as a weapon, the aching void of their absence that had defined my childhood, was finally gone. But a new silence took its place. It was no longer a lack of them. It was a release from them. It was my personal freedom bought and paid for with the truth. 1 year later, I sat in my office. It had been Arthur's, but it was mine now. The faint, sweet smell of his pipe tobacco was long gone, replaced by the scent of fresh coffee and the ozone from the new 3D printers on the floor. Vance Manufacturing was thriving. We'd just landed 2 new aerospace contracts, and I had just signed the charter for the first Arthur and Clara Vance apprenticeship program, a full-ride scholarship for local kids going into trade school. The door opened, and Ben Carter walked in, not with a briefcase, but with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one on my desk, his smile easy and familiar. "You look like a CEO," he said. "I feel like one," I replied, taking the mug. We were partners in business, and as it turned out in life, we were building something new. I looked out the window past the parking lot to the factory floor where the massive presses were already hard at work. My parents had tried to steal my inheritance. They and their high-priced lawyer thought that meant the money, the house, the factory. They didn't understand. My real inheritance was the one thing they could never touch. It was the knowledge of how to build something real. It was the strength to protect it. And it was the freedom, the hard-won freedom, to choose my own family. They thought I was just his granddaughter. They forgot I was his apprentice. And the first rule he ever taught me: measure twice, cut once. They were a bad cut, and I was finally done measuring. Taking that final clean breath of air, Melissa Martin's fight was finally over. What did you think of her final strategy? Let us know your thoughts below. We read every single comment. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.